Okay, I hate to break up all the conversations, but there will be more opportunities to keep chatting. Thank you again to all our speakers from this morning, from the first session, for really information-dense presentations. They gave us a lot to think about. All right, we are now going to have our first panel discussion on what we've learned about sub-sewershed sampling. So I will introduce your moderator for that. Dr. Zuzana Bohrer, MPH, is a Health Planning Administrator 2 at the Ohio Department of Health in the Bureau of Environmental Health and Radiation Protection. She is managing the Ohio Wastewater Monitoring Network since its inception in May 2020. She earned her Master of Public Health at The Ohio State University and has over 10 years of research experience in drinking and wastewater treatment at Duke and Ohio State University. I think something got omitted there, Zuzana, but you get the idea. She knows what she's talking about. There you go, Zuzana.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here. So this will be a panel discussion, but we still will have an introduction from each of the speakers for maximum 5 minutes. And so we have plenty of time for questions after. Once the speakers introduce themselves and have that intro, I will have 1 or 2 questions, very general for them, so each of them can respond to that, and then we will open it to the floor here and online. We will try to alternate this time between the room questions and the online questions or questions from the other rooms. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker, which is Katherine Graham. Katherine is an assistant professor in the School of Civil and Environmental Engineering in Georgia Tech. Her lab studies the fate and transport of viruses in the built and natural and water environment, including methods development for an implementation of wastewater-based epidemiology for emerging viral diseases.
Thanks. Thank you. And just for representation, I finished my PhD at Stanford University in 2021, but I was a Michigan undergrad, so sorry, Zuzana, but go blue. So today I'll just be talking a bit about Georgia Tech's on-campus sub-sewershed efforts. This project got started actually before I started at Georgia Tech. It's sort of separated into a research arm as well as an operations arm. And I'll just sort of briefly go over what that looks like for us. So the project really started out as sort of operational work. So it was a huge initial effort from Kostas Konstantinidis's lab at Georgia Tech, Joe Brown's lab when it was at Georgia Tech. He since moved. Our core facilities on campus, the molecular evolution core team, led by Anton Briskin, as well as the university administration. We started with this on-campus sub-sewershed monitoring effort, really because we don't have an on-campus wastewater treatment plant, but we do have easily accessible manholes that students had been working with in the past. It was initially run by research teams using passive sampling methods, so something we haven't really talked about a bunch today, but we started off with that passive sampling method, mostly using more swabs, and now we sort of transition to the more conventional composite sampling and sort of handed this off basically to operational staff, like actual staff at the university, where they operate these composite samplers, or these auto samplers, as I should say. We initially started with 6 to 10 sites on campus. We've reduced those sites over time. This is an example of the type of dashboard that we display to students. Our sites are anonymized and we aggregate the data, just showing moving averages over time. There's some little descriptors for students who want to look on campus or just general local community. This is publicly available. And we've just been working on this over time. So this is really what our project looks like today. But initially, the project was sort of more of a research effort starting in 2020. And we really because of the expertise in our lab on metagenomics and bioinformatics, kind of wanted to understand, especially in the context of our passive sampling methods compared to composite sampling and grab sampling, sort of more in of a research framework, understand what that looks like and what it means for our campus sampling efforts. So using shotgun metagenomics, we investigated the saturation of microbial signals in passive grab and composite samples from manholes. So really here we're kind of trying to get a better idea of some practical insights that we could provide to our on-campus partners, that once we sort of shifted the operational work from the research team to the staff on campus, we found similar composition of different microbes using these different types of sampling methods, although we're still investigating how different sewer sort of flow rate characteristics, et cetera. We talked about pH today, for instance, other types of things may impact the trend. So we don't commonly introduce or use this shotgun metagenomics strategy for our sub-sewershed monitoring, but we do kind of use it at a couple snapshot windows in time to help us gather more in-depth information about how our different sampling types affect the interpretation of our data, essentially. So we analyze saturation trends over time in different sampling types, and we were able to provide some time estimates for the campus operational staff that they may only need to deploy 6 hours our passive samplers in each manhole we can monitor on campus. So that's one example of the type of information that we work with our operations team on campus. In the plots here are from our recent article where we took some of our shotgun metagenomes and we wanted to really examine the microbial community in these different types of samples, passive, composite, grab over time. We deployed all these types of samples in parallel over a couple different time scales, and again, used this data, sort of presented it to our university administration partners on campus to help them make some decisions about how to make the project a little bit more informed over time. We also do some qPCR and dPCR work, especially related to our questions related to different types of sampling methods that we're using on campus. So this is, again, some data that we gathered a couple years ago, comparing concentrations of some of our indicator viruses or fecal strength estimators, as well as our SARS-CoV-2 metric on the right, N1, looking at basically concentrations from the same samples, but using different methods over time. And typically we find that the swabs are more enriched in our viral targets due to various reasons. And we were able to communicate that to, again, our administrative partners on campus to help them understand what types of samples they might want to implement just for binary presence absence in low incidence periods. So this is, again, a huge effort. These are some pictures of some of our initial efforts at passive sampling on campus. A lot of grad students spent a lot of time on this, but this is my contact information, and I'll be on the panel afterwards.
Thank you. So we have our second panelist is Dr. Natalie Ram. She's a professor of law at the University of Maryland Francis King Carey School of Law and adjunct faculty with the Berman Institute of Bioethics at Johns Hopkins University. Professor Ram is a leading scholar on the intersection of genetic privacy and the law. Her work has been published in both law reviews and scientific journals, including the Harvard Law Review, Science, and Nature Biotechnology. Professor Ram was a 2021 Greenwell Faculty Scholar in Bioethics. She is an elected member of the American Law Institute. She earned her JD at Yale Law School and AB in Public and International Affairs at Princeton University.
So I should say up front, because this is a room of doctors, not a doctor. JDs don't get to call ourselves doctors. So just to clarify. So I am really delighted to be here to talk to you today about legal and ethical considerations for sub-sewershed wastewater surveillance. Together with colleagues who are involved in actually doing the wastewater surveillance. I'm there, not a scientist, just a lawyer, friend who comes along to make sure that we're all playing by good rules and to tell them, don't do that. I've written quite a bit over the last couple of years about the urgent need for ethical and legal engagement around wastewater surveillance. We have to think about, and I'm really glad to be here to talk with you about ethical and legal implications for wastewater surveillance and its infrastructure now or like 3 years ago, rather than as issues arise and you're faced with a difficult request for access or desire to add something new, and you don't have a framework for thinking about whether you should be sampling for one thing or another. So, given our panel's focus on sub-sewershed surveillance, I want to focus mostly on some of the legal and ethical considerations that are heightened as we move from community level wastewater surveillance to the sub-sewershed level. Specifically, we really have to talk about individual identification, risks, and privacy. And here I'm talking about individual human identifications and privacy risks. So typically, of course, individual privacy concerns are really attenuated when we're thinking about wastewater surveillance because the monitoring occurs on a population-wide basis. Any single individual's input is irretrievably mixed with input from others, and irretrievably aggregate data, in theory, poses little risk to individual privacy because there's very little individualized information that can be discerned from the aggregate sample. But wastewater surveillance, as we've heard earlier this morning, isn't inherently or necessarily aggregate in the data that it discloses. Private companies and the presentations we heard this morning already are engaged in increasingly more granular sampling, right? And private companies engaged in wastewater surveillance are touting the increasing granularity of the data that they can provide. And existing COVID-19 wastewater programs are already doing what amount to single block, single building surveillance, as we see with nursing homes, dormitories, hospitals, airports, and the like. So in that context, we might see cryptic or unusual lineages that can enable the tracking of a single individual within a population-wide sample. That's not my tweet / post on X. But this is one which many of you are probably familiar with. Mark Johnson was able to use one of these unusual cryptic lineages to infer where a specific individual both worked and lived. Didn't put a name to that person as far as I know, but that's a reasonably small population able to track an individual person's movements. And here's another graphic from my colleagues in Michigan in which a single individual was identified or identifiable from an unusual lineage detected in a sewer shed of thousands of people. In that case, the sewer shed included a hospital, and the putative source of that cryptic or unusual lineage, an individual patient, actually died shortly after being discharged from the hospital. And so you can find more information about this case if you're interested in this afternoon's poster session. Now, the National Academies in its work on wastewater surveillance thus far has limited its analysis to community-level wastewater surveillance, and so it has been able to sidestep conveniently many of the difficult questions that can arise when sewer sheds cover many fewer individuals or small groups can be identifiable from the wastewater stream. But as I've argued before, somewhere along the spectrum from our entire sewer shed, from the wastewater plant drainage system to the neighborhood sewer shed to a nursing home or a meat processing plant or a hospital to a single home, wastewater surveillance will disclose sufficiently individualized information to implicate ethically and legally weighty human individual privacy concerns. And that means we've got to think about what that means now and about how the surveillance system might be used in the future, what this means for research and for public health going forward. So to take just one example, because I write principally about genetic privacy and the criminal legal system, law enforcement appears never to have met a surveillance system that they did not want to exploit. And yet law enforcement entanglement with public health efforts has, as I'm sure you all know from the last 5 years or 4.5 years, right? When we think about public health through the lens of law enforcement, it doesn't go so well for public health, right? This entanglement is bad for public health. It can also be bad for law enforcement. And it can be bad for community health more broadly, right? And so with wastewater monitoring for opioids and other drugs already underway, I think we really need to think carefully about whether we should be doing that kind of sampling and about how to construct a robust firewall preventing law enforcement, for instance, from accessing or using wastewater surveillance infrastructure, samples, and data in order to really keep the public health effort that undergirds wastewater surveillance from being contaminated, as it were, by law enforcement and its differing norms and priorities. So I want to offer, in closing, one tool, perhaps maybe unfamiliar to some of you in this room, that may be pertinent as we think about protecting research samples and data in this space. particularly as those resources raise greater risks connected to individual identifiability, and that's the certificate of confidentiality. The certificate of confidentiality is a federal statutory protection for identifiable, sensitive biospecimens and data about individuals, human individuals, collected for or through research. Here are two important things to know about certificates of confidentiality. First, certificates are not just another hurdle you have to clear, like getting through the IRB or getting informed consent. I know lots of researchers are like, what? That's a drag. It's important, but maybe you don't want more hurdles to get over. Certificates aren't like that. Instead, certificates are an additional protection that researchers hold on behalf of individuals whose data may be implicated in research, and it renders that data immune from the legal process and inadmissible in evidence. In non-legalese, this means that research data protected by a certificate shall not be disclosed, even if a researcher were to receive a court order seeking to compel that access. And if the data is wrongfully disclosed, the certificate's protections exclude that data from being used in any kind of legal proceeding. And here I'm thinking about maybe criminal legal proceedings, right? And so basically, a certificate empowers and indeed requires researchers to refuse to disclose sensitive identifiable data and biospecimens, even when they're served with a court order. Now, second, less helpfully, and then I promise I'm almost done, certificates only apply to research, right? And so that means that public health work, if it's under the bucket of public health rather than the bucket of research, may be ineligible for a certificate, even though public health research, now we're bringing the two buckets together, right, would be eligible for that work. So now, if you're doing something that qualifies as research, right, make sure to obtain a certificate for your work. If your research is federally funded, maybe your funding agency has already issued you a certificate. If so, you should find out because you have legal obligations. The identifiability and privacy risks here are real. Individual identifications can and will be performed in the future, and the stakes of weak protections for that data are significant. We got to focus on these issues now and how to mitigate them. Thanks. Here's a list of all the other work we've done on wastewater.
Thank you so much. This is really great to have you here, and I'm sure there will be a lot of questions about your work and privacy, but we have the next panelist, and he's virtual, and it's Drew Rostain. He's the Environmental Support Services Supervisor for the City of Tempe, bringing 9 years of municipal water and wastewater experience. He holds a bachelor's degree in sustainability and a minor in urban planning from Arizona State University, and has been with the City of Tempe since April 2021. He plays a pivotal role in the wastewater BioIntel monitoring program and oversees the fats, oil, and grease pretreatment program. Drew's supportive and innovative programmatic approach has led to the expansion of the wastewater BioIntel program, incorporating more sample locations and enhancing data tracking capabilities. Drew's ongoing commitment to program development underscores his dedication to environmental stewardship, public health, and the promotion of healthy communities at the local level.
Awesome. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. Thank you for the great introduction. I am Drew Rostain. I'm the Environmental Support Services Supervisor here at the City of Tempe. I'll be talking about our wastewater BioIntel program, and it's going to be just a very high-level overview of our program. I do have more of a technical side. Than having experience with the labs and the science behind it. But so Tempe is unique. As you can see here, this is Tempe displayed here, blown up into different pieces, different areas. So we don't have a wastewater treatment plant here in Tempe. We actually have a partnership with 5 other cities, with the city of Phoenix. So all of our wastewater actually transitions to Phoenix. We have 2 Mesa sites, which Mesa is to the east of us, neighboring city, and that runs through 2 of our sites. So we have 11 sample collection areas total. We actually sample at 13 locations because 2 of Mesa's sites run through 2 of our collection areas, and we sample all of these areas 2 to 3 times per week. So with these collections areas running through one another, not all of them run through one another, but Some do. So with that comes some complications in how we calculate and analyze and report our data. So we have essentially, it's almost like we almost have 11 wastewater treatment plants that we're sampling, and all the maintenance and everything that goes along with it. So our progression, so we started our whole program started back in 2017. The discussion of our wastewater BioIntel program started back in 2017 with our communities. So we had about 3% of our EMS calls were opioid related. And during that time, we had a town hall meeting with our city council and Tempe citizens to discuss a storyboard and a dashboard for this program. So with the support from our city council and citizens, we actually launched our program in 2018, and we had 5 sites originally. And these sites, there are wastewater metering stations, so they were already infrastructure that existed. And then in 2020, we actually expanded to 8 sites. And then in 2023, expanding to 11. We should be expanding here soon, hopefully in 2024. If not, early 2025, we'll have an additional 3 more sites. So some of these larger areas that you see in 2023 will actually get a little smaller. Our smallest population is actually the town of Guadalupe. We have a agreement with them, and their population size is estimated at 6,500. But our Tempe, the next smallest site, is actually 90. I believe it's 9,300 is our population for our smallest site. So back in 2018, when we launched, we were sampling for just COVID. Just for opioid. And then as COVID hit, we actually transitioned from opioids to COVID. And then once COVID we started kind of getting our bearings straight with the pandemic, we actually started expanding from COVID back to opioids and other biomarkers. So we actually have 8 chemicals that we are sampling for. And then 13 different pathogens. So we have a total of 21 analytes or biomarkers that we are sampling for and analyzing. And then we have we've had some different biomarkers that we've actually transitioned out, as we haven't had any hits on them, and they weren't providing us much benefit to what we were looking for in our subsewershed.
Okay. There's no other
Next slide here.
Icon. Oh, okay.
We're able to go to the next. There we go. Thank you.
You have like out of time.
Okay. So this is our City of Tempe's dashboard. We have, if you go to the QR code here, it'll actually take you to the dashboard on the left-hand side. If you click on the biomarker groups, it'll actually show all the different biomarkers. And this is just a snippet of one of the dashboards that we have. This is for COVID-19. It's our weekly averages displayed here. And you can change the graph to see different time periods. And there's a lot more dialogue that you can read about on each of these pages. But we have our public displayed dashboard that's available to the public.
Thank you.
And these are some additional sites, but I'll be happy to answer any questions and go into more detail about our program in our panel.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Drew, and stay with us. We have one more panelist for introductions, and then all of them will come sit here and answer some questions. So I want to welcome Dr. Kirsten St. She is the Director of Virology and Chief of Viral Diseases at the Wadsworth Center and a clinical professor in biomedical sciences at the University at Albany. Her laboratories perform diagnostic, surveillance, and reference testing, including wastewater testing and sequencing for viral pathogen, as well as applied research. She is the principal investigator on several grants, corporate collaboration, national reference centers for influenza and vaccine preventable diseases, scientific director of the New York State Sequencing Consortium for SARS-CoV-2 surveillance, and serves on several national and international advisory committees. Research interests include new diagnostic platforms and viral molecular evolution.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here, and it's a pleasure and an honor to be with you today and tomorrow, and also delighted to join the group of Centers of Excellence. We're really thrilled with that appointment. Initially, I had a slide in here that showed the network in New York to give some perspective, and I took it out for the sake of time, but that was probably not good. We're a fairly sizable network with 205 sampling sites in the municipal sewershed sampling, so it's pretty big, and also a fairly extensive program in terms of the types of things that we test for, and that's important when I get to the next slide. So in 2022, we were surprised, to put it mildly, to detect a case of poliovirus in one of our New York City hospitals. And the ability to turn on wastewater sampling for that virus was incredibly important. For those not familiar with polio, about 70% of polio infections are completely asymptomatic, and about 30%, most of the rest, have symptoms that are indistinguishable from other viral infections. Less than 1% actually present with paralysis, about 1 in 1,000. And so basically you can't see where it is clinically for the vast majority of infections. And the only way to track where it is moving in a community effectively is through wastewater. And so it was just as well that we had this very well-established network around the state to see not only where it was, but where it had been retrospectively, because we have a lot of retrospectively stored samples. And when we pulled them, we could see this. This is all of the sampling sites around the case that were sampled. The blue squares are showing the samples, wastewater samples that were negative. The red ones were the ones that lit up as positive. And so to our displeasure, we could see that there was actually quite a bit of circulating polio around the case. To show you how tiny the area was, this is the state of New York here, and right here are the only areas that were positive. And this is those areas blown up down here. So it was actually a very tiny area. This was around the Orthodox Hasidic community around the case. And these are very closed type communities. It was extremely difficult to get vaccination updates. They have low vaccination rates, not because they are specifically anti-vaccination, but for numerous social issues I haven't got time to go into. But they also have a general distrust of government and government agencies, not just with the Department of Health, with the Education Department and everybody else. And so despite the desire to sample upstream to get more localized information so we could get to the source and vaccinate the children, there were serious ethical and privacy concerns that Natalie just spoke to. I'm sure she would be horrified. We would have seriously alienated a community that was already proving extremely difficult to work with. There were some initial early attempts and suggestions at doing upstream sampling, but they were quickly shut down because we were already up against the wall dealing with this community, quite frankly, and we would have really shut it down completely. So we had to stop. The next example is our experience with cryptic lineage, which Natalie also spoke to, following the deconvolution of sequence data from wastewater with the analysis so-called cold, a B11, B117 in 3 samples from a plant in Suffolk in April 2023. Why was this surprising? Because B117 hadn't been in circulation since August 2021. And there's a tree of where it's placed. So we've got, whoops, go back. So we've got Omicron here, XBB here, others here, Delta, and here's this outlier that should never have been there. It was a very strong signal. It persisted for months. We couldn't identify the source. Now, this is not so much a public health issue, but scientifically and from a virologist's point of view, we really want to get to that source because there is so much to be learned from an unusual virus like this in terms of the virology, the pathogenesis, the transmission, the virulence. These are gold mines, and we desperately want to get to these patients and isolate the virus and so on and so forth. And so there's huge impetus, but we understand the privacy issues and so on. So this is a huge dilemma for us, and we are anxious to work with lawyers to get around it. Next, experiences with antimicrobial resistance. We did have a pilot program on AMR for municipal wastewater, and we did not find it informative, and it's felt to be much more relevant to do it on facility sites, and we have a proposal just funded for that for hospitals and major nursing homes. I can't report on it. We haven't even initiated the testing yet, but we feel that it's going to be much more productive, and I think that's a different area entirely when it comes to privacy. Next is testing in colleges and schools. We did do that extensively in some areas of the state during the height of the pandemic, and it assisted enormously with COVID control, and it's much more efficient, obviously, than testing hundreds to thousands of individual students. But it's actually fallen out of favor in our state, so I'm really interested with the programs that still use it extensively around schools, which we've heard presentations on today, but it was not deemed cost effective for most areas of our state, and most places have shut it down. And finally, opiate and other drug testing. We've heard presentations on that as well today. But in our state, there have been major concerns expressed about stigmatizing counties or regions as being drug centers. And therefore, we have not progressed very far at all with initiatives on that, although there's great interest among some people in the department. And then the likelihood of upstream or subsewershed sampling for us is remote, because even at a regional or county level, there are concerns with it. Arguments have been made for data assisting for law enforcement, and we completely understand that. But there are major issues here with privacy, and especially also with people on prescription medications. We have seen just in my own group, the governance group for New York for wastewater, a recent proposal which is coming in any day now on over-the-counter monitoring of over-the-counter fever and influenza medications and their metabolites as an early indicator of epidemic and pandemic activity, which may be a less sensitive issue for people. This is similar to a proposal that I saw some time ago from Rick Bright about monitoring those same drugs. I'm almost done. Those same drugs in prescription, in pharmaceutical sales. So the use of these meds, OTC fever meds, the use of these meds can be an early indicator of endemics and pandemics. And the same thing, we'll see it in the wastewater. We'll see these indicators long before we see clinical data and ordinary clinical surveillance data on pandemics and epidemics. So I think this is huge potential. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We will have time to speak about all these things, because please, if I can ask the panelists to come forward, I will just ask one very general question, and then we will just give it to the room. And there is the microphone in the middle of the room, and then there is also. So if I can just ask each of the panelists to very shortly comment on, so do you believe that, are there specific scenarios where you believe wastewater subsewershed or building monitoring to be the best surveillance option for successful public health action?
I'll start. So our campus does not have a wastewater treatment plant on campus, and there is institutional will to keep sort of a macro level idea of COVID transmission on campus via wastewater. So for us, Subsewershed was our only option really to sort of keep a handle on that wastewater wise. Something complicating this, for better, for worse, is we actually don't have sewer maps on campus. So for a couple sites, we had to, go upstream, do dye tracer tests, like some of the other talks have talked about. But anyways, in that sort of case, I think that's an interesting application of subsewershed monitoring as well.
So is there a case of sub-sewershed sampling that I think is a great idea? I might actually put airports on that list. Airports are places where people are transient, so you're not monitoring the same population day in and day out, particularly if you're just monitoring the airplanes themselves and not the airport staff who are regularly there. And especially as we've heard, as an early warning of new pathogens coming in. Again, I think it's really important to think about what we're sampling for. In fact, I think that might actually be an even more paramount consideration than that intersects with, what's the size of the sewer shed that we're sampling.
Thank you. Kirsten?
Certainly agree on airports. I think also some of the facility monitoring with hospitals and nursing homes, we had devastating fatality levels in our nursing homes in New York during COVID pandemic. And I think potentially monitoring nursing homes and the ability for early detection there and mass prophylaxis across the nursing home has a great potential as well.
Great, thank you. And Drew?
I think as other panelists mentioned, the airports is a great place to monitor, and as well as hospitals or any building, I guess, with an agreement that they're going to be sampled. I think sampling within a city, such as Tempe, in different areas is great for a community to see, what levels are in their vicinity, so they can take the precautions or know what's going on, so that they can assess and take the precautions necessary that they feel fit.
Can I?
Mm-hmm.
I want to distinguish between airports and hospitals, in part because the privacy interests we bring with us to the airport when we fly are much more attenuated than the ones we bring with us when we go to a hospital where we receive medical care from physicians, which is a paramount or a classic paradigm case in which we expect to have confidentiality and privacy, right? We have physician-patient privileges, and we don't have like the airline passenger privilege. That's not a thing. And in fact, when you're flying internationally, you have no real constitutional or other privacy interests of a weighty magnitude, because you don't have a right to travel internationally necessarily. Now, if you have a US passport, you have the right to come back to the US, right? But generally, airline travel is a privilege and not a right.
That's a great point. Okay, so can we go to the question? When you have,
I was just going to add, we did sample a hospital. We had an agreement with the hospital, and we didn't display any data on that hospital. It was only for the hospital to receive the data. But we actually have stopped that. I just wanted to add that, we did sample a hospital at one point. But we never displayed any data to the public or issued anything. It was only for the hospital's knowledge, because we had an agreement with them at that time.
Okay, thank you for the clarification. So can we go to the first question? Please introduce yourself and then.
Why is it something with me and microphones today? Okay, now you can hear me. Cindy Friedman from CDC. And I'm just really happy to hear you talk about airplane and airport sub-sewershed as not having as many issues as the other sub-sewershed locations. But I guess the question is about confidentiality for Natalie Ram with the airlines. My colleague Ian Ruskey is here. He and I have spent a lot of time talking to airlines about their confidentiality concerns. And I just wanted to ask if you had any thoughts or had given any thought to this, because it is different. Like when you travel as an individual, when you go to the laboratory on the plane, it's not yours anymore. It's mixed with everybody else on the plane. I don't see that as a big issue, but I do hear from the airlines their confidentiality concerns, and we've really tried very hard to protect their names. But I mean, ultimately, I don't know if I was interested in that certificate of confidentiality, but it's not really research, it's public health data?
Yeah,
Thanks.
so I think unfortunately, a certificate of confidentiality probably is not forthcoming for your airline monitoring program. If I understand the confidentiality concern, it's from the airline that they don't want the public to know that they're participating in the program. Yeah, so this goes to whether or not companies compete on privacy, right? Which didn't used to be something that happened. Nobody reads terms of service. Nobody pays attention to who's collecting, storing, selling, using their data until recently. And in the last, I don't know, 5 to 10 years, we've we've seen a growing interest by corporate actors in competing on privacy. I mean, I was watching the Olympics, and Apple has a dozen commercials that are like, we don't sell your data. I can't speak to the accuracy of that statement, but they're competing as a more private model. And so I suspect that what the airlines are interested in protecting is they're worried about competing or being outcompeted on privacy, right? And insofar as they think the kind of monitoring that you want to do is valuable, but they don't want to potentially take a commercial hit for, as the non-privacy protective airline, right? That might be where that concern is coming from. I don't, corporate privacy is a different sort of thing than individual human privacy. I think actually some of the environmental monitoring that we heard of with the dye manufacturer in the prior panel was really interesting, because there it was a corporate entity, and whether and how corporate entities, right, they're persons as a matter of law, but their privacy interests are really not quite the same as our individual natural person privacy interests. And so I don't really have a great thought about that, but that's what I imagine they're concerned about. They're concerned about competing on privacy.
Yeah. And they're concerned, I think, also about competing on if we find something and it's attached to their brand and the other airline they're competing with doesn't have that pathogen, it looks bad. And I think also in the US, particularly litigation from passengers against the airlines is a concern. And we've been told like this could be a link between a pathogen and someone getting sick, it's evidence in a case potentially.
Yeah, again, it'd be super great if we could get certificates for public health data, right? Because then it wouldn't be available or admissible in evidence.
Right.
That's one of the primary features of the certificate. But again, the certificate is really limited to research. Congress could enact a similar statute directed at public health data. But
I mean, that would be great,
Okay.
just to make this like a routine, a routine entity,
If we can move, do we
collecting.
have questions from the other rooms, Jen, or online? Not right now? Yeah. Okay. Go ahead from the online room.
Oh, all right. So looks like we have. Can you hear me?
yes.
All right, we have another question for Dr. Ram. Certificates of
Oh, this is going to be like a private
Yeah.
law lecture.
I cannot give you legal advice. I'm not acting as your attorney.
Okay,
I'm not
go
a member
ahead,
of the bar
sorry.
of the state of Georgia.
So how should state or federal entities handle the potential conflict of freedom of information versus desire to keep data private to protect individuals? For instance, if a public health department samples schools for drugs and wants to aggregate data to avoid stigmatization, but the data can be requested through freedom of information channels.
That's a great question. So FOIA, the federal FOIA statute has an exemption for private information, right? So there's a number of exemptions to FOIA. One is for private information. There's been some litigation about whether, again, corporations have the right kind of privacy that they get to be protected under that exemption. They do not. Supreme Court said so. But natural persons, you and me, are real flesh and blood bodies. We do have access to that, or that exemption does apply to data about us. Now, that again kind of like walks this line of, if the data is aggregate, is it private, right? And there's been this assumption that if the data is aggregate, it's not private anymore, right? But I think more and more we're finding that that is a contestable assumption, right? And you know, the more contestable it becomes, the more the folks holding that data who are subject to FOIA requests might think about whether that aggregate data is susceptible to, say, individual or small group identifications, and thus implicates the kinds of privacy concerns that that FOIA exemption is meant to protect.
Thank you.
I'm not your lawyer here. Let me
Yeah,
just
and if
repeat
we
that
can
again.
try to do also questions for other panelists, please. Can we have from the room now again?
Hi, my name is Rachel West. I work with the National Wastewater Surveillance System. This question was for Natalie Ram, but also for the other panelists. How do you think about consent or assent when it comes to increasing granularity? And that's sort of ethically and legally. So when we get to really small populations, including facilities or businesses, who consents to that sampling? Is there an ethical or legal obligation for them to get consent from individuals in that facility, particularly if it's residential or if it's a business where folks are more, I guess, centralized throughout the day. So I just wanted to ask that. Thanks.
Drew, can you maybe talk from your experience? I know you did a lot of community engagement in Tempe.
Yeah, so we actually are currently, we've been actually working on, and not myself personally, but our strategic and innovation office has been working on ethics and communication policy, and it should be coming out within the next month or two. They're just finalizing it currently. But we have a publicly displayed dashboard. We sample our smallest population area is 6,500. We're not going to go any lower than 3,500 is the smallest population size if we ever got to that for our build out. And we don't have any I guess aspirations to sample places that are seeing like a single building. We just don't have we don't want to sample like an individual building. We're trying to help out our entire community, and we don't want to have privacy issues come from that. So like I said, we're finalizing our ethics and communications policy, which should be coming out. And when we do build out more areas, we're getting close to that build out, and we'll have 14 areas total. We're not going to be sampling like a small section of population. So we're hoping we want to keep everyone's privacy. We're keeping that in mind. We've kept that in mind from the beginning, and so that's something that we want to keep going forward with our program.
Thanks. So I think consent and assent are really tough issues here, right? Because one of the primary virtues of wastewater sampling is that you get everyone. And at least in many instances, it can be done discreetly. And so you could do it without the community knowing. But I think that has some, problems with it. Number one, if we want public health to have public support, we need public trust. How many times can you use public in one sentence? Okay. And that means that it's actually really important to do public engagement and get community buy-in where you can. That's not the same as individual assent, much less individual consent, right? And as a practical matter, I don't know how practicable that is, right? Again, because the thing that you're sampling is going to include, it's also going to include, people who are just passing through, right? I'm not normally in that community, but I was passing through and I really needed to stop at the gas station, right? And so, I think that this is one place where we need other tools to generate public trust. For instance, by building a firewall that says this is for public health, maybe for public health research, maybe for other scientific research, though maybe we can talk about how broadly we want to construe that permission, right? But not say for law enforcement, right? And that if we use those other tools, we can generate public support, even in the absence of individualized consent, which is not practicable.
Right. Okay, thank you so much. I wanna
Kirsten?
give others time.
Yeah, I just make a few comments. I think, it's a simple question, but it's a complicated answer because the answer is it depends. It depends where you're sampling, why you're sampling, and it's very complex. I think if you're going to facility level sampling, for example, it starts with the leadership of the organization where you're sampling and a big discussion there, and they would be hopefully consulting with their legal counsel and so on. And it also depends on the size of the place you're sampling. In some ways, the bigger it is, the easier it is, because the smaller it is, you're starting to get close to individual identification. So I think it's a very complex situation, and what you're sampling for increases the level of sensitivity as well. So it's a very complex question, actually.
I'll just add one other thing. So on campus, we sample from buildings, we sample from groups of buildings, and we actually have samples from areas that we don't know what is feeding into it. And I think that at least from an institutional level, there's some sort of safeguards, not maybe like a legal firewall, but around just monitoring trends from these small sub-sewer sheds, because our institute doesn't take action and we don't do any additional methodological testing that would lead to identification of individual persons. So yeah, I think I agree that it's very context dependent.
If we can take again question from the online room, and then if you could speak closer to the microphone so also the other rooms can hear you, please.
All right, this one's for Drew. Can you talk about some of the public health actions that were taken based on information from the opioid data?
Yeah, so we use everything's like I said on our public dashboard. We use the data to communicate with our partners. So we send our information to CDC and to our county. And I'm not sure exactly the navigation of that information. I'm more on the technical side, so I collaborate with our teams here to go out in the field and actually sample from the sites. We send it out to all of our samples go to 5 different labs that we have partners with, which involves a lot of coordinating. So I'm not on more of the, like I said, I'm more on the sampling and technical side, and our strategic and innovation office deals more of handling where that data goes and what the data is used for. So I'm sorry, I can't answer, I guess, exactly your question. But if you send me an email, I'm happy to reach out and answer your question more thoroughly.
Sounds good, thank you. Okay, we go back to our room.
Hi, thanks very much. I work in the airline industry. Just looking at this scope of the confidentiality problem, you have an aircraft that has, say, 100 people on it, some of them are smaller, or you have an airport that has 10 million people passing through it every year. So the scope of the problem is bookended, I think, by the airline industry. And it really does, and the same with all the good work that you guys do here in the communities. You're going to have guidelines and probably regulation. I mean, I come from a regulatory background, and you can't just have an individual institutional policy, because it will be destroyed by an individual probably who tries to challenge it. So I would urge that there is some national framework made of guidance and even legislation. And the people, in my view, at the top, who are WHO, an organization known as ICAO, which is International Air Transport, should also make these rules for agreements that when an aircraft of one country lands in the state of another, for example, they have the sort of jurisdictions relating to public health and also the carriage of passengers. So could the and maybe not Natalie, let the others think what they say. You know, what do you say to that? That there needs to be an actual formalized framework. Thank you.
I think that was comment, right? There was a question.
There's both.
Okay.
Can I just ask for clarification? Do you mean an international collaborative?
Well, you can start with the federal, because that's a bit easier, because you're only dealing with one state. If you want to do the world, it's 193. So that's a much bigger challenge. But why is there not a federal regulation or guidance, or did you use the Data Protection Acts, for example?
Yes, real law is better than in institution by institution guidance. I spend a lot of time talking with folks about, your institution's policy internally to do thus and such with the data, hold it for this long, not share it with that other person. That's not, in the absence of some real source of law, regulation, statute, whether state or federal, that's not gonna, someone comes along to compel you to disclose that data, you're gonna have to disclose it. Odds are. Now, you can try and fight that off, but that's more difficult to do. That's one reason why I'm such a big fan of the certificate of confidentiality. That's an actual statute enacted by Congress that provides robust privacy and confidentiality protection for research data about individuals. It's quite a remarkable and remarkably robust tool. And it would be great if we could get something similar, whether a certificate analog or some sort of national framework. It'd be best if Congress could do something, but Congress, maybe there's an agency that can do something. There's a couple agencies in the room. So, there are regulatory approaches that could be taken if there is statutory authorization to make regulations. Another big legal question.
I think at least one more online, and maybe one we can still squeeze in the room, but.
Yeah, so we have one for Dr. St. George from Kyle Bohannon on Zoom. And his question for you is, how did you approach the cultural sensitivity aspect with the community that had the polio outbreak? Here in Oklahoma, we do have communities that have multiple reasons, including anti-vaccination sentiments that might be a barrier to sampling.
Sure. So we were fortunate to have a number of members of staff who were practicing in the Jewish faith, but we also worked with faith leaders in the community. We went to the rabbis in the community who were cooperative with us, and also some faith groups within the community who were cooperative and worked through them. Without that, it would have been absolutely impossible. We needed to go through faith-based groups within the community rather than just sort of bolt in with the "we're from the government, we're here to help you" kind of attitude. That would get us nowhere. So we needed to go through faith-based leadership and faith-based groups within the community to try and gain their trust and work from there.
Time for more questions now when I'm looking at the time. So can we go back to the room?
Thank you. Adam Gashkari, I'm with the Eurofins Group. I'm really curious, in terms of high-risk substance testing, opioids or other illicit substances, there are some fantastic programs that have been developed here in the United States, but you look at our counterparts in Europe and they are miles ahead of us, through the establishment of the Sewage Core Analysis Group Europe, multinational monitoring efforts. What do we need to do here in the United States to be able to reach that point in this type of analysis?
Any takers? I don't know. We are all looking at you, Drew, because you are probably the most experienced with the.
Yeah, so I think we need to continue to sample as we're doing and relay this information as much as we can to our public. I know I know it's a big effort for me and all the team members that help on my side for this program to get where we are, and most importantly, you know, it takes you know, a team of people that are motivated to help push this type of work to fruition. And I feel like you know, sampling things, I guess all the biomarkers and analytes that you can sample for are very important. And the biggest thing is it costs a lot of money. It costs, you know, a lot of time, and you need to have a lot of support behind it. So to get to the point, I don't think there's ever like an end. I guess there's always goals that you want to get to achieve. So it's always about growing and bettering the information, better, you know, analyzing things that are, I guess, the most important at that time, just so that we can, I guess, take action or take precautions depending on, you know, what the findings are. I guess those are my, I guess, takeaways or thoughts on it.
So a few thoughts. First of all, I come from a very strong clinical background. I spent more than 20 years in academic clinical medicine before I came into public health in 2004. And in that background, there's a huge quality assurance and regulatory control over the system. And I think we still have a long way to go in wastewater testing to get it standardized and regulated so that it is a lot more uniform across all of the testing. And I think the will to do it is there, but it's not an easy uplift. And I realize that, but I think we certainly have the expertise to do it, and we should make every effort to get that done. That's number one. Number two, I think we need the political and public will to do it. And to do that, we need to show that we can generate good, actionable data that actually has an effect on outcomes. And we need to focus on that, just endlessly generating data that is not used for anything that you can demonstrate has been useful and had an outcome is not going to help. We need to demonstrate its utility and how it was used and a positive outcome from the use of that data, and demonstrate that to politicians and demonstrate that to the public. We need to be a lot more vocal. We need to get together with journalists and have articles published that the public can see, that the politicians that can see, not just in our scientific journals. Thank you.
Nobody else is volunteering, so we can go to the next question. And I'm starting to lose track of where we were. I think we are going online. Sorry.
So we have one for Dr. Graham. So the question is about saturation on slide 2 or 3. And they were wondering, is it a threshold of representation of the variety of family sequence IDs? And do you know which library prep method the Georgia State group used to prepare the whole prokaryote-eukaryote panel?
Yeah, so I'll answer the last question first. We use the Nexteria XT kit. We use short read Illumina sequencing for all that data. In order to answer the saturation question, we kind of took pretty much like a 3-prong approach, and that work is published in Water Research. It was published last year. So we looked at short reads, taxonomy over time to understand at what point in time did we maybe see changes in a grab sample or composite sample compared to a passive sample, and that's in more detail in the paper. We also assembled mags from our data for prokaryotes, and we used a time series mining tool to understand clusters of mags and how they tended to saturate and signal over time. Again, I got amongst the 3 signals, which is a way more complex method than I have time to talk about here. And then we also used the dPCR data. So with each of the 3 together, we kind of came up with this recommendation to our campus administrators for deployment time based on that data.
Okay, and is there a wastewater metagenome approach, like off the shelf, to such a library prep?
Yeah, certainly. So we do all of our library prep in-house. We do all of our, well, we technically do our sequencing in our campus core, and we do all our bioinformatics in-house. So as far as library prep, absolutely, we use the Nextera XD kit from Illumina. We order it. We use our wastewater extracts. And again, these are shotgun metagenomes. So we're not amplifying a specific organism, just all of the DNA in the sample. And in that paper, we only focused on double-stranded DNA. But yeah, we just used the off-the-shelf Nextera kit for that work. And the details are in that paper.
Great, thank you.
Did you want to say something, Drew?
I don't have anything.
Sorry. So we can go back to the room again for question.
Hi, everyone. Amy Lockwood from Verily. And I have a question for Dr. St. George about the AMR testing. You made a comment that seemed like a throwaway comment, but I think there's a lot underneath it of looking for issues around AMR in the community samples and recognizing that there wasn't a lot of value and that you were moving up into facilities. I'd love to get a little bit more color on what it is that you did and why you feel so strongly that there wasn't value in looking at AMR issues in community level samples.
Unfortunately, I actually can't speak to that because I'm a virologist and it was not my project. It was spearheaded by Kim Musser, who is the lab chief for bacteriology at Wadsworth Center. So I'm sorry, but I can't tell you what the targets were. But she was pretty emphatic that general municipal wastewater testing was not particularly helpful because the size of the populations that you're testing are so big, in some cases, several 100,000 people, that she felt that it just was not meaningful or actionable. And whether or not it's coming from a hospital source or patients in certain situations and so on, she and the epidemiologists in the state felt is actually more important, and getting a handle on these resistant strains emerging under conditions of hospitalized patients under extreme drug pressure, or are they really out in the community? And those sorts of questions are really the crux of the issue. And that's where the vital questions need to be answered. And so that is why they're going after facility testing. That's a sort of global view, but I can't get into specifics because I'm sorry, it wasn't my project.
Fair enough. Thank you.
But I'll be glad to put you in touch with Kim Musser so that she can answer more specifically.
Great, thank you. Any online questions still, Jen? No. Is there any other room questions? So I will just finish up all with kind of more general questions. So maybe that's kind of question for all the panelists. So what obstacles did you encounter when sampling, analyzing, or interpreting Subsewershed surveillance data?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear
What
the question.
obstacles did you encounter when you were doing Subsewershed monitoring projects? Obstacles.
Obstacles. Sorry. Community pressure against it. Yeah, there was serious in the community that was already sensitive to government intervention. They were a lot more sensitive when we started getting close to their schools or close to their sites of faith practice and so on, that we were really invading their privacy. They were sensitive to that.
We had sort of the opposite problem, somewhat. We actually do not take public health action on campus due to or related to our wastewater data. There's been a lot of pressure from the research side to start to use the data to inform students or inform public health action on campus. We do not do any of that. So I'd say that's an obstacle in our view on the research side, is that the data is not really worth the money, the manpower, the effort, if you don't take action based on that data. So I think that sort of coordinating action, at least in our campus example, passive sampling takes a lot of people, a lot of effort. and I think actually lack of pre-existing data on how to interpret passive sampling data, particularly related to its quantitativeness. That has also sort of been an obstacle that we've been eager to sort of tackle as a research team as well.
I do have so some obstacles that we've, I mean, from a technical standpoint, maintaining all of our equipment, making sure that it's operational. We always strive to get a composite sample. Worst case, we get a grab at our locations. Each site is unique and different. So depending on the run, we have different types of tubing. So we have either silicone or we have a high density polyethylene tubing. We have a lot of issues sometimes with sites being more grainy, with granular things that can slice the tubing, or we have a lot of larger items that are through our collection system that can clog our samplers. So eliminating, I guess, the variables that can cause an area not to be collected for a composite is my biggest goal. Always want to get a composite if necessary. So we have actually maintenance a maintenance log and what should be done on a weekly, monthly, and quarterly basis just to ensure that everything's being maintained. Most of our sites have refrigeration units, but we do have some portable units that do require icing between events. So that's an obstacle. We have to constantly ice those before the sampling event starts. So that's an obstacle. We get flow data on a weekly basis. So all of our dashboards are updated on a weekly basis. So we have 5 labs. So sending out all of the samples, making sure chain of custodies, everything is quality checked, is sent out properly and gets to the proper laboratory is an obstacle. And then updating that flow data, like I said, we actually just had an incident where we don't just get the flow data from one particular site, or like one some of the stuff is online, but we don't get, all of the data is not on one register, or one particular website. So getting the flow data for all 11 sites, sometimes we're reliant on a stakeholder or other stakeholders, and it's out of our control. And so without that flow data, sometimes we can't update the information on our dashboards on a timely fashion like we designed to. So there's a lot of obstacles that we have to constantly, overcome and conquer. And it's not just one person. There's a lot of communication that goes into a program like this. I'm sure all of you are aware that there's a lot of people involved, a lot of communication, and I'm thankful that everyone has their expertise and we work together to accomplish, the end goal is to report the data and get the samples. I guess the biggest obstacle is, making sure that everyone is in communication, because if there's a site down because of sewer maintenance, it's not just, okay, like the site's not going to collect sample today or this week or next week or for the next several weeks. It's communicating that to all the labs so that they're aware that they're not going to be receiving that sample. Also, the people that update the dashboards or get the flow data for those sites, everyone is in communication of what's actually happening out in the field at specific locations. So, there's a lot of different moving parts to a program and a lot of different obstacles that in every field that people are navigating continuously.
That was great. Thank you so much to all panelists for answering all the questions and the introduction. And I'm sure people can come and ask you follow-up questions. And thank you.